Hello, I'm Martina Kelly, and welcome to medicsvoices.com, where we speak to key opinion leaders in health and medicine. And today we are talking to Emeritus Professor Bob Woollard, who is based in the University of British Columbia. So, Bob, your career has spanned such a large time, and I was thinking that maybe more than 50 years. And I wondered if over that time you could share with us maybe 2 or 3 moments that were seminal in your career or that gave you big insight and shaped the things you've done over time.
The primary one, I would guess, that relates in some measure to my career in medicine was in the 1960s during the civil rights era, working in a black hospital in South Carolina, where I met my wife of now 57 years. And that is undoubtedly the most significant thing that happened. And I only mention it because, in a sense, the career of medicine has opened up so many doors over time, over the world, that I've been very privileged and maybe interested to know that I'm only a doctor because of a pool shot, a billiard shot, because I grew up in a poor and limited education family, but with parents that were obsessed with the idea that the way out of poverty was education, and our job was to get educated, which we did. I went to university after graduating from a high school with 12 others. Uh, anyway, to make a long story short, the professor of history had offered to get me into the London School of East Asian Studies, the sort of premier of the time. My high school principal said I should become a doctor, which was news to me because I didn't really know what a doctor did, except that they sewed up my finger and it hurt like fury. Anyway, I had to make up a decision, and as a colonial boy, went to a friend who had a toffee British accent and said, "What shall I do? I've been accepted into medicine, and I've been offered this in history." And he happened to be shooting billiards at the time. He said, "Well, I don't know, Bob. I'll tell you what. If I make this shot, go into medicine. If I miss this shot, go into history." And so he made the shot. I still remember the sound of the ball going into a pocket. It was relatively difficult. I'm not religious, but that's as close as I could come to say maybe there's some intention in the universe that I should do this. So I did. And as I say, had I not done that, I would not have met my wife. I would not have had the fortunate career that I have had. And I guess that's what your question makes me reflective. What a fortunate, fortunate life I've had in so many ways. And so, what would I say except that almost every moment of it has been very positive, um, and at the same time, partly because of what I've often said with students and so on, practice of medicine is a little like crack cocaine. It can take over your life. And in an era when I was young, and I think it's changed. I hope it's changed. Um, the sacrifices for that good fortune were paid by the family,
Mm.
and I was just very, very fortunate myself because I was a country doc for 2 decades while we were raising our children. My wife grew up in rural South Carolina, and we didn't think we were smart enough to raise kids in the city, and I think we were probably right. And so for 2 decades, worked in a very small place, a little 10-bed hospital. We were delivering 100 plus babies a year in that little hospital, seeing all kinds of trauma and so on. And what I would reflect partly at the time and more in retrospect is that the most fortunate career in life is that of a small town GP. The problem is that the worst job in the world is the spouse of a small town GP. Um, so and these cross over because after 2 decades out there, it was time to move on as our children grew up and so on. And I moved to the university after that. And I sometimes, again, reflect that my wife uttered two-word sentences or questions actually um, that changed my life at critical moments. The first one was obviously I do when we got married. Well, 20 years later, after meandering through the um, the small town, what happened one day? We were looking down at the setting sun along a row of trees that we had planted and so on, and I averred that when we retired, this would be a bunch of purple prose about golden tunnels and rubies hanging on them and all this kind of stuff. Well, she was very tolerant, as you can tell. And she looked a little bit puzzled, and then she said, "Are you planning on retiring in Clearwater?" I said, "Well, I guess." And then she uttered this second rhyming couplet. With who? That was October. In March, I had a job at the University of British Columbia in the Faculty of Medicine, and we moved to Vancouver. So I guess if I were to try and reflect on the trajectory of the career, those are salient moments because we tend to. This, of course, would be foreign to you as an idea, but physicians tend to take ourselves rather seriously. and and so we think it's the medicine that makes us. And I think if nothing else, I'd like to reflect at this stage of life that that's just the fortunate vehicle of our lives. And if we acknowledge that and try to maximize the sharing of that good fortune, that's probably as good as it gets in life.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit because one of the things I was reflecting on when I was thinking about your career was that, in a way, I think an outstanding aspect of your career has been your ability as a family physician, okay, initially from a small town, to really drive international conversations on topics of social consciousness, I guess, like social accountability, sustainable health. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that, about the role of family medicine as a social agent for change.
As it happened, I was practicing in this small town, little 10-bed hospital. A large uranium mining company from the east wanted to build a uranium mine in our town at a time when regulation of that sort was almost absent, believe it or not, because of differences between the province and the federal, and this kind of fell between the two. So I was called on to look at what the implications were, and it didn't take a lot of research to know that it was going to be very adverse effect on life. And anyway, I became involved in that, and the power, I think, that is invested in a community that are they're not vested in physician. The respect that you automatically get because of past actions of the physicians and so on, gives you a remarkable a degree of influence. And that very quickly grew. It's a long story, but very quickly grew to become kind of an initial cause célèbre. And I was at that time, believe it or not, long-haired hippie doctor from the bush, which the media loved. And when I asked the medical association to get involved, they jumped on it. And so almost overnight became a kind of a national presence in moving forward. And we eventually had and still have a embargo against uranium mining in British Columbia, notwithstanding there are significant deposits here. Let me give you a story which I think is emblematic of that. Before I was born, a great uncle who was a tragic survivor of the First World War, and remember in the novel All Quiet on the Western Front, Remarque dedicated the book to, as he said, this book is dedicated to those who, though they escaped the bullets and the bombs, were nonetheless destroyed by the war. Well, I had an uncle who was destroyed by the war. He was in he was jealous of another chap in the very small rural area they were, around a woman, chercher la femme, oui. And so he mailed poisoned chocolates to this chap. Now it was these were bachelors living in a shack, and the other bachelor happened to pick up the mail that day, and he happened to open the package and eat it. Anyway, he died. The point of that is that the chap that he was trying to kill became my patient when he was an old man, when I was a young doctor. And as I frequently say to folks that are interested in listening, he didn't trust me because I was a Woollard, because I shared my uncle's last name. He trusted me because I was a doctor. And I have to earn that every day. So that it's that kind of thing that opens doors, and the responsibility that comes with that. And I think being a generalist and a general practitioner means that you need to be constantly adaptive and listening. I mean, yourself from one patient to the next. One just wants you to fix them, just like your car. Just come in, tell me what to do, give me the prescription, and I'm out of here. And don't ask me a bunch of questions about my life. And the next patient is going to come to you for a much broader sense of who they are, what does health mean to them, etc. And you have to adapt to that. Well, in the political sphere, it's not that much different. That adaptation, and I was fortunate enough to be in a situation to get involved with a lot of international work, and particularly, and I want to acknowledge Charles Bolin, who was the sort of father of the social accountability movement in medical school. I've learned a lot. He's a very valuable and continues to be a very valuable mentor. And the idea of social accountability, which is essentially being useful, at the level of the individual physician, be they generalist or specialist, and so on, is, I think, a a reflection that we can be useful, and we can be useful in different ways, and we need to be useful. Well, if you take that up a step, well, what about the institution that trains us? What about the university that creates the physicians of the future? not old guys like me, but young people with a very different set of capacity, with a different, very different approach in a very different society, a society that one might even say is going mad right now. It becomes incumbent, I think, uh, for those privileges and for that institution to also be useful, and as I reflect, the historian in me reflects, medical schools began in Padua in the 14th century at a university. Why the heck should a medical school be at a university? If it's a text training school, why should it be at a university? Well, it happened. And so, as a consequence, I think the profession as it meandered through, although it still retained at the faculty level a lot of those kind of 14th century Catholic Church hierarchy, as opposed to a community of scholars, um, is it's kind of maintained that, but at the same time, it also has developed the capacity to influence the society around itself. So just like we have individual responsibility, I think there's this collective responsibility to be useful.
I love the way you were actually able to. So many people are faffing around trying to define social accountability, but I think this one-liner of just be useful sounds pretty good to me, you know. Um, but perhaps riffing a little bit off your story of your uncle, but also being a bit more serious. The title of your book, Fatal Consumption: Rethinking Sustainable Development, I wondered about what made you think about this idea of fatal consumption and reflecting on that in relation to, I guess, primary care, the role of family doctors and things like that, because it's a pretty gripping, well, I found it a pretty gripping phrase.
Well, I moved to the university, as I mentioned, in 1989. What I found there was a remarkably fractured, specialized, isolated silos of knowledge, which coming from a very, uneducated family was a shock to me because I'd always revered that the ivory tower on the hill and so on. It happened to coincide with the publication of the Brundtland Report, which is a major United Nations report led by Gro Harlem Brundtland, who is at that time the past Prime Minister of Norway, and it was about the idea of sustainability. The idea, as she wonderfully simply put it, not using today things that our descendants are going to need for their welfare. Um, Not that we're good at it, not that we even acknowledge our responsibility in that, but nonetheless, it was a clarion call. And when I looked around, it happened that the president of UBC at the time was the chair of the roundtable that was Canada's response to that report about sustainability. Uh, and uh, and I looked around. They were doing, it was just things about should we bury PCBs, should we burn PCBs, et cetera, et cetera. And I, of course, not realizing the hierarchy was there, dropped a note to the president saying, well, how can you talk about sustainability without talking about health? And so he turned back. He said, why don't you get together a task force and put that in the process? So okay, well, I guess we'll need nursing and medicine and school of planning and social work and and so anyway, my long story short, it brought together that people who I think were just amused that somebody like me would be inviting them. And here's the conjunction of human as well. My wife, bless her, because we'd grown up in the country and because you didn't invite people without feeding them, said, well, you can't have these people coming without feeding them. And she made, which has now been famous in my life, a salad niçoise. And so all these heads of departments and associate deans and stuff came into this room and they said, salad me small. Anyway, that became really the genesis of what ultimately became the book, which is written. I mean, I edited and wrote bits and pieces, but basically, it was people who became involved in that task force, which was called the Task Force on Healthy and Sustainable Communities, because it was very obvious to me that there is no way that interprofessional work could take place until you got out into the community. That the academic culture at the time, some extent still, is people talking past each other, using the same word for different concepts, using different words for the same concept without even realizing it. But once you get engaged with the community, then you've got something. And the essence of social accountability, as Charles defined it, was that connection to the community. Because how do you know what their needs are? How do you know what their wants are? How do you know what their health is if you don't talk to them, if you don't engage with them? There's also a part of the academic culture that I found quite disturbing at the time, and that was the capacity of the academic culture to sit around and whine. That I used to think the it's the nest of the classic whine and geez party that like says, if we only had the money, we could, without realizing that where there's a faculty of medicine in an academic institution, the faculty of medicine gobbles half of the money, half of the is it's hugely fortuitous where we're situated, because the idea of health does have and should have a universal appeal. And anyway, that realization that there needed to be engagement, not consultation, engagement of the community, just became a bit of a watchword in terms of how things. And then I, by chance, began working in Nepal, developing a medical school there that was focused on rural and lower caste health. That's been remarkably successful. And right now, in fact, this morning, I was in Kathmandu virtually uh, because we're in the process of establishing a university. And that's an example. You remember the pool shot I mentioned? Well, I've been, for my sins, I chair an international advisory council of folks from more than a dozen universities around the world: MIT, Harvard, Maastricht, University of Tokyo, etc. A group of folks who are developing a liberal arts university. In fact, one of my closest working person on it is a historian from MIT. Uh, and so it's again an example of good fortune and an example of why one owes that good fortune something in return. And I guess if it comes right down to it, I suppose I sometimes reflect. I wake up beside this wonderful woman I have for 57 years. Um, and the ghost of my grandfather from the Outer Hebrides of Scotland is sitting on my shoulder. And he says, "Ah, laddie, you dinna deserve this. You better get up and earn it."
I think that's really great. It's been wonderful talking to you, and thank you so much for telling us about your life and I think inspiring people, because I think many people mightn't see that the ability to speak up actually is the power to change the world, which is, I feel, quite inspiring at this moment in time. So thank you very much.